Hi everyone. This video is going to cover obedience and power. This topic is discussed pretty extensively in chapter 4, and I'm going to leave out some of the descriptions of the experiments. Specifically, I'm not going to spend a lot of time summarizing or re-describing Milgram's obedience studies or the Stanford prison experiment. I think both of those things are explained pretty well in the chapter. What I will do is spend a little time talking about some of the notable outcomes and some of the insights that come out of those studies. So, just as a heads up, right, this lecture will work very well with the content of the chapter. All right, so let's start by noting that social interactions and the dynamics of intergroup relations, in addition to all of the other things we've talked about with regard to conformity and compliance and obedience. All of these things are also shaped by power. Now, we haven't really talked very much about power up to this point, but I want to introduce it now and have a little bit of an exploration of that. So we define power, or we can, and for our purposes, we will be defining power as the ability of a person to attain goals in spite of the resistance of others. So, again, attaining something that is hard isn't necessarily an exercise of power. Attaining something that people are trying to prevent you from attaining is an exercise of power. So power is, in essence, an ability to overcome resistance. And two famous research projects that sort of show the role of power in structuring social interactions and the intergroup dynamics that people experience are, as I mentioned, Milgram's obedience studies and Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. And again, you can look to the chapter. These are sort of fully and I think sort of richly described. And honestly, there's a very good chance that some of you have even actually already been in some way made familiar with these experiments or these studies. In Milgram's case, a couple of things that sort of stand out in the results and the findings. And it's not just Milgram's study. I want to point out that these studies have been replicated. They've been reproduced and the findings replicated in other settings and under different conditions. So in Milgram's experiments and in subsequent replications, researchers have found that 50% or more of participants were willing in these experiments to essentially shock a person to death. Right. This is one of the sort of noteworthy and for many people sort of a disturbing finding that comes out of this set of experiments. Similar results came from studies that were done in other societies. So it wasn't just in the United States. Researchers have reproduced this study in Austria, in Australia, I believe in Denmark there were some studies. It was done in Spain and in a few other places, Jordan. So people have gone out and they've taken Milgram's design and they've applied it to people in those social and cultural contexts, and they found very similar results, which is that people, in response to authority figures directing them to do so, have demonstrated a willingness to cause harm to other people. But the real, I think, important and noteworthy finding, at least from a sociological or a social psychological perspective, is that social situations are what create obedience. Right, a lot of people were sort of in the years after the discovery of some of the atrocities of the Second World War, a lot of people were worried that this was kind of an innate tendency in human beings that people want to harm other people. But the results of the research, the results of these studies suggest that people are not particularly disposed to harming other people, but rather people are sort of disposed to conforming to authority, right? The presence of and the operation of power is a strong situational influence on whether a person does something, especially whether or not a person does something that is contrary to what they might normally do. So social situations are ultimately what create obedience, and the manipulation of the conditions of the experiment sort of led people to realize that as the authority of the Confederates in the experiment, right, as these people who are sort of directing the activities of the actual subjects of these experiments, as the authority of the Confederates is reduced, obedience declines. Right? It isn't just that the people have been given permission to engage in some kind of sadistic behavior. It's that when the legitimacy and the authority of these figures directing their activities is undermined in ways through again manipulating the conditions of the experiment, people are less inclined to follow orders. As other experimental conditions are altered, obedience declines, right? So the experimenters found that as they manipulate the conditions of the experiment to change the degree to which the situational pressures are acting on the participants in the study, their tendency to obey, the participants' tendency to obey sort of goes down. So power, it turns out, is kind of situational, and as the situation is changed so that power declines, conformity and obedience similarly sort of drops off. And very similar conclusions can be drawn and are drawn from Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, right? That human behavior is much more influenced by context than by individual factors. And that when that experiment was subsequently reproduced, they found much the same thing, right? That it was the situational conditions or the context that drove people to engage in the behaviors that they engaged in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the different types of power, because one of the interesting things that comes out of this work was a sort of more systematic and careful consideration of what power is and how power operates and what kind of forms power can take. So given that power is important, right, researchers and theorists sort of said, well, it's going to be useful for us to sort of have a sense of the types and the operation of power. And there are 5 types of power, and I've listed them in the chapter, and I'm going to go through them here in the lecture in an order that reflects those kinds of power that are most likely to produce public conformity. That's where we're going to start. And we're going to end on the kinds of power that are most likely to produce private acceptance. Now, remember from previous lectures and earlier in the chapter, public conformity is people going along with the rules, a kind of normative compliance. We're going to do the thing that's expected of us because it's expected of us. It doesn't necessarily mean that internally we've accepted that this is a proper set of behaviors, right? It's just we're going along because we're supposed to. Private acceptance is that we've actually begun to change the way we think. We've come to accept internally the values that presumably give rise to the norms that we would embrace and sort of just make a performative sort of acknowledgement of when it comes to public conformity. So public conformity is kind of right on the surface, right? You're showing other people that you're going along. That doesn't necessarily mean you agree. Private acceptance, you're still going along, but you're going along because you've bought in, because you agree that this is how you're supposed to behave. So we're going to start with reward power, and reward power very much is about creating public conformity to norms and expectations. And we're going to end on expert power, and expert power is the one that is most likely to generate what we call private acceptance. So that's the order that these are listed in. So as I said, we're going to start with reward power, and reward power is a capacity to influence other people based on the ability or the promise to deliver desired rewards, which is where we get the word reward in reward power, right? So people basically get other people, influencers, get the influenced to go along with them by, in essence, promising them or actually delivering rewards, right? The rewards can be material, they could be social, but the point here is that they create a compliance. They create a degree of conformity to the conditions under which the rewards are going to be doled out. Now, this is impacted by individual level variables, like most of these things are. So we don't want to sort of neglect that. So, for example, the degree to which the person being influenced values the reward will determine, to some extent, how much compliance or how much conformity that influenced person is going to basically display. There are other contextual factors that play into this as well. So, for example, when rewards are scarce, reward power is going to increase in influence. Now, putting that into, say, everyday English, your boss can get you to do a number of things by promising you rewards. In this case, usually money, right? Your wages and other kinds of financial incentives. When jobs are scarce, right, your willingness to put up with whatever it is the boss is trying to extract from you is going to go up, because the rewards of financial remuneration, right, the rewards of pay, are going to start to shrink, right? That this job you have starts to look like the only option that you have in front of you. Then you're going to comply a lot more with the demands of the influencer, in this case, your employer. If, on the other hand, right, jobs are plentiful and it's relatively easy for you to go out there and get one of those jobs, or the reward of money is not as important as something else in your hierarchy of needs or desires, then the ability of your boss to sort of influence you by threatening to either grant you, promising to grant you money, or actually granting you money, is probably not likely to be as influential as it would be if you really valued the reward, if you really valued those wages. So that's reward power. And again, you get a tremendous amount of sort of public conformity, but it's always somewhere in the mind of both your employer, both the influencer. I shouldn't make it as narrow as employment. It is always somewhere present in the mind of the influencer as well as the influenced that this is highly transactional, that the obedience or the conformity that's coming out of this relationship is a reflection of the fact that there's something in it for the person being influenced, that it isn't necessarily that this person wants to be contributing. They're contributing because they're being paid to contribute, or they're contributing because they're getting something out of that they value. Coercive power is sort of like this. It's just sort of the flip side of that, right? So reward power is about the granting of rewards. Coercive power is about getting people's compliance through the use of force, including punishments or the threat of punishments, right? So the withdrawal or the withholding of rewards. So again, just like with reward power, punishments can be either material punishments or they can be social punishments. And nobody really likes to be on the margins or on the outside of a group looking in. So sometimes the threat of isolation or some other kind of social sanction can also be particularly coercive. It doesn't just have to be financial or material. Again, coercive power is not particularly conducive to trust in either the influencer or the influenced, because the influencer never knows for sure whether the person is complying because they want to comply or because they're being threatened with something if they don't comply. So the relationship that exists between influencer and influenced in this particular form of power is always one in which the parties can and often are very cynical about the nature of that relationship. And again, the kind of conformity that gets produced by coercive power tends to be public conformity and not private acceptance. Legitimate power, which is the third form of power, is a capacity to influence others that's based on the influencer's position or role in the group, and a recognition of their right to require and demand compliance with the things that they're asking us to comply with. In other words, somebody holds a position that is seen as legitimately vested with some degree of power, and the people in the group, the people being influenced, recognize the legitimacy and the right of that person to sort of demand the compliance that they're demanding. So, legitimate power can reflect a couple of things that are somewhat interesting, right? So first of all, the positions that people occupy are seen as conveying legitimate power. That's a recognition of social structure and the deployment of power, the deployment of standing and legitimacy as a function of cultural and social norms, right? So, for example, we could think about the application of legitimate power in governance, right, and presidents and senators and congresspeople and mayors and governors and all these people who occupy positions of power. The position itself is seen as the place where the power sort of resides. So that's one place where we see sort of something interesting and insightful coming out of an exploration or a study of legitimate power. The other thing I think that we see reflected in looking at legitimate power is the degree to which the people who occupy those positions, the influencers who are asking us for compliance, who are asking us to submit to their influence, many of them occupy those positions because we sort of put them there. Again, think about the example of voting, right? So we elect somebody mayor, we elect somebody governor, we elect somebody president. They ask us to do certain things. The fact that we put them there sort of creates additional pressure on us to kind of comply, to allow ourselves to be influenced, because we want to believe, we want to see our decisions as having some legitimacy. Well, it's like I elected this person, or I helped to elect this person, but I don't see them as having any sort of legitimate power over me. Becomes kind of a nonsensical notion, right? So the degree to which these structural arrangements and the power that's vested in them, and then the people, of course, who get put into those positions so that they can exercise that power, because we play a role in that, there's an investment on our part to sort of legitimize the power through submitting to that influence, by being influenced by the people in those positions. So you're going to get a very interesting mix, I think, of some degree of public conformity, but you're beginning to see possibly how this particular kind of power might also produce, at least in some influenced people, a certain degree of private acceptance, right? In part because, if you are in some way sort of responsible either for the arrangement of power or the selection of people to occupy those positions of power, it would be really hard for us to sort of have a solid ground for resisting their attempt to influence us when we sort of put them in a position to influence us. So you're going to see an increase, as I said, in private acceptance. But this is, again, kind of a midpoint between public conformity and private acceptance. Referent power is much more likely to produce private acceptance. And referent power is, in essence, it's a capacity to influence others that's based on their identification with, attraction to, or respect for the influencer. So in situations that involve referent power, the influencer tends to be, one, a member of an important reference group, right? Somebody who is important to us, somebody whose opinion matters to us. To make an analogy here, that would be sort of like Mead's generalized other. Remember, Mead's generalized other is the perspective of others that we use to sort of evaluate ourselves. It can be a community as a whole, or some really, really broad construct, but it could also be a very narrow construct, relatively speaking. It could be the people who form our reference group, the people whose perspective matters most to us, right? So if a member of our reference group is asking us to engage in some kind of behavior, if they're trying to influence us, then it's more likely that they are going to be able to exercise that referent power. So that's the first group or category that influencers tend to be in when it comes to referent power. The second is that the influencer could be a charismatic or a dynamic or a persuasive leader, right? So we find ourselves sort of identifying strongly with the influencer because they have a certain quality about them that makes us want to be liked by them, or to be recognized and validated by them. And we reason that part of the way we get there is allowing ourselves to sort of follow them, to be influenced by the direction they want to take us, or the things that they want us to do. And then the third set of people, this third set of influencers that tend to have referent power, are people who are particularly attractive or famous. And I think this is kind of similar to the second group, but sometimes popular people represent a kind of in-group status, or aligning ourselves with popular people or attractive people or famous people allows us to sort of be on an inside rather than on an outside of social groupings. And again, as I mentioned, it's likely to produce referent power, is likely to produce private acceptance, because the influenced identify very strongly with the influencer or influencers for those reasons that I just kind of went through. The last of these is what we call expert power. Expert power is a capacity to influence others that assumes that the influencer is highly skilled. So expert power functions as a kind of, or a style of, informational influence. What that means is we see the influencer as a source of accurate or valuable information. So as the influenced person, we want to sort of comply with their efforts to influence us, their efforts to lead us, their efforts to exercise power. Because we want this accurate information, because we want this valuable information, we are much more likely to have an internal sort of acceptance of the legitimacy of the conditions, right? The efforts that they make to influence us are likely to reflect a desire to be influenced in the way that they're trying to influence us. So teachers could do this, or people with high levels of skill in particular occupational categories, people who have skills and talents that we ourselves would like to have some degree of understanding of or access to, right? The people who possess those things tend to have a deal of influence or power over us, because we kind of want to be like them. We want the same skills. We want the same accurate and valuable information. So because this satisfies a kind of internal need for us to fill a niche or a need, we're much more likely to embrace this at an individual level rather than just kind of publicly going along with what experts say. So so those are the 5 different types of power, and a little bit of an exploration of how those things operate. I think that should let us wrap this up for now. If you guys have any questions, of course, please don't hesitate to ask. And until the next time, then I'll just say take care.